Hey, as we're getting started, here's a question I want to kick around for just a second. How many of you would say that you crave efficiency? You say, well, what do you mean by efficiency? When I say efficiency, what I mean is this. You're the type of person who you've got to get all the groceries in on the first trip. Who's like that? You've got to do, yeah, like all the guys in the room. We're like that. So here's how it kind of works out. Like you've got like 10 bags in each hand, right? And you're like, I've got to get it all in one trip. And it's not a big deal if you kind of live in a situation where it's a short trip from the car to the front door to the kitchen. That's not a big deal. But if you're in a situation like my first apartment where my wife and I lived when we first got married, and you've got to walk up 3 flights of steps after walking across a long parking lot, it gets a little intense. Like you're walking and like you got your veins bulging out everywhere. Like even the veins in your forehead are popping out. Your knees are shaking. Your arms are about to fall off. You're about to have a freaking hernia trying to get all the groceries in at the same time. And then you set things down, feeling returns, and you're like, I've accomplished it, like you just won the Hunger Games or something. That's what I mean by the thrill of efficiency. A lot of the guys in the room can relate, and if you're married, all of our wives are like, well, why can't you just make a couple of trips? And it's like, because I have to get it all done at the same time. It's like the only thing I can compete at anymore because I'm not a good athlete anymore. Like all my success in that is like in another life, and this is like the only thing I can feel like I accomplished something at. So maybe the guys in the room, we can relate to that. But I want you to think about that picture of somebody trying to carry all the groceries in at one time. And I think in many ways, this is a really great illustration for what so many of our lives look like. Because we are trying to do so much. You know, for example, like if you're married, it's like, well, I got to spend time with my spouse. I got to go on a date. Got to make sure we have quality time. And, oh, now there's a kid in the mix, so I got to make sure I spend time with my kid and my wife. And as a family, I got to make sure it all happens, and we get enough sleep, and we get everything taken care of, and all that sort of stuff. Oh, and I've got a job, so I have to work 40 to 60 hours a week and make sure projects are done and deadlines are met. I've got this boss who's just really a pain, but I've got to make sure I keep him happy. So there's that. Oh, and then kids have projects and school and extracurricular activities like baseball or soccer or dance or cheer. We got to make sure they get all those. And on top of that, I've got to make sure I got a good relationship with the in-laws. So we got to go see the in-laws, and we got to see my parents, and I've got friends, and I've got hobbies on the weekend. I've got to golf or hunt or do whatever it is ladies do. I guess it's shop, maybe. I don't know. I've got to do all that. I've got to make time for that and do all this other stuff. Oh, and by the way, I've also got to go to church. I got to make sure I spend time with Jesus every day. I got to get in a group. I got to get on a team, and we've got so much, like I'm exhausted just saying all that stuff out loud. We are so busy trying to do so much stuff, and metaphorically, like our veins are popping out, our knees are shaking, our arms are about to fall off, trying to do way too much. Like maybe you come in here this morning, you can relate to that. Like, yeah, that sounds vaguely similar to my life. I'm just trying to do so much stuff, and it's not unique to any of us. This is something that if you just happen to run into somebody on the street, they likely share this characteristic of life with you. In fact, did you know between 60 and 70%, according to one study, and the difference is whether you have kids or not. Like if you have kids, it's 70%. But 60 to 70% of people say that they are too busy to actually enjoy life. They've got so much stuff going on. We've got so much stuff going on that we can't even enjoy the things that we're doing. And here's where it gets really, really interesting. It's never that we're doing bad things. It's never that we're just going and doing stuff that is like blatantly ungodly. No, it's actually we get really busy and over busy doing a whole lot of really good things. And that makes it difficult to say, well, I can obviously drop this because we're like, yeah, but that's a really good thing. Like I don't feel like I should drop that because it's good. It makes people happy. I kind of enjoy it. And so it's like, man, how am I supposed to drop something if it's a good thing? And it's a tension that we have to kind of navigate. But I think one of the ways we do that is we back up and we start asking the question, okay, why do I feel like I have to do all this stuff? Why do I feel like I have to do this, and all this other stuff? And I believe so often the answer for that is very simply this. there are other people that expect things from us. And we feel obligated to meet those expectations. Or we have expectations of ourselves. And maybe they're realistic. Most likely they're not realistic. But we feel like, man, I've got to meet these expectations that I've set up for myself. Or perhaps we think, well, I'm pretty sure God wants me to do all this stuff. And so we think God has some expectations. And we're like, well, I need to do all this because of expectations. In fact, our lives are driven by expectations, just like the expectations that drove the life of a woman named Martha. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to Luke chapter 10. And here's where we pick up the story. Check this out. It says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. Now, let's talk about that for a second. All of us, like the question we kicked around during community time was, who would you have over to dinner if there was anybody you could have over? Like, all of us have heroes in our lives. Maybe they're like up close, like a close relative, or maybe they're like a little distant or whatever. But we all have heroes that if they showed up in town and they were like, I'd like to come over to dinner, we would be like, this is awesome. So what would we do? Well, we'd make sure the house is clean. Like, they wouldn't be able to tell we have kids. Like, especially if you got kids, like your living room is normally a disaster. But man, you would have that thing cleaned up and they'd be like, wow, how do you keep it so clean with 4 kids? And you're like, oh, it's this way all the time. Not true. We kind of maybe do that sort of thing. Like, you wouldn't buy them takeout or Pizza Hut. You'd like go into debt like hiring Gordon Ramsay to cook them a meal. Or you would find a restaurant like the fanciest thing you know and present it. And they'd be like, wow, do you cook this way every night? You'd be like, of course I cook this way every night. Like, of course I'm a great host. You'd maybe do that. You would go above and beyond to meet expectations. Why? Because this is somebody you're impressed with and you want them to be impressed with you. Totally understandable. Now, take that and multiply it by about a factor of 50, and you get the idea of what it would be like for Jesus to physically come to dinner in your house. Because for Mary and Martha, this isn't just a friend. This is the guy that they believe, rightly by the way, is the Son of God, is the Messiah. He's the one that the prophets of Israel prophesied for hundreds and even thousands of years. And they're like, this guy is coming to town. We want him in our home. We're going to make him have an awesome experience. And so you can understand that pressure that maybe Martha would feel under, because like, okay, like this is obviously a famous dude. He's important. Like, I'm sure he has some expectations. Like, he's not going to be happy with McDonald's. He wants to have an awesome meal. He's not going to be happy with a dirty environment. He wants the home to be clean. And by the way, culture at that time would have expected Martha to be a great housekeeper, a great homemaker, an awesome host. So she's like, man, the culture has expectations. I'm sure Jesus has expectations. And Martha would have had expectations of herself to present the best possible environment for Jesus. Now, Martha has a sister named Mary, and you would think that Mary would carry around the same expectations. But that's when it gets really, really interesting. If you turn to verse 39, it says this. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. Now, it's difficult for us to understand just how weird that is in that context, because we look at that and we're like, well, yeah, that seems like a great idea. But in that culture, people would have looked at that and they would have looked at Mary and said, what are you doing? Because in that day and time, this was just a cultural thing back then, so if you're a lady, don't get offended. But in that day and time, the women were expected not to be sitting at the feet of a rabbi learning. They were expected to be getting the house ready. They were expected to be cleaning, to making the meals. And so if people had looked and seen Mary there sitting at Jesus' feet amongst his other disciples, they would have been like, this is weird, Mary. Don't you know that culture has these expectations? And by the way, Jesus probably has these expectations, and you should even have these expectations. So what in the world are you doing? Other people would have thought that. And Martha absolutely would have thought that. In fact, watch Martha's reaction, verse 40. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. That word distracted there carries this idea of being very frenzied, very, very frantic, like moving around very, very quickly, in a hurry, stressed out, kind of like all of us were. Like if you went out of town for Thanksgiving, like getting the car ready, especially if you got kids, like that's a stress-inducing experience. You get in the car and you're like, man, I just need a nap from packing, right? Like if you have kids, you've been there. But she's very, very stressed. And I think, based on what we're going to see in a second, I think she's not just stressed. I think she starts to get angry. And like, just be honest. How many of y'all have ever, like you've kind of done housework kind of angry? You've been there before? Like you kind of stomp around, like you're washing dishes, you kind of clatter the dishes a little bit. It sounds like, man, what's going on? You put dishes up and you go to the cabinet, you go, bang, you slam the door, you're walking down the hallway and your feet sound like this. And it's like, man, they are obviously ticked off. And I think that's where Martha gets, because what we're going to see in a second, Martha keeps looking over at Mary and she's like, she's not helping me out. And if you had a sibling that wouldn't help you out with chores, like you get this, like you're like, I want to go strangle him. And so she gets frustrated. And finally this happens. It says, she came to Jesus and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to come help me. In other words, Jesus, my sister's being lazy. She should be in here. After all, culture expects us to do this. Like you probably expect us to do this. So I don't know why she's sitting there. I expect us to do this. And so tell her to get off her rear end and come into the kitchen and help me do things. Now, here's a question to ask. Was Martha doing anything bad? Well, the answer is no. I mean, it's a fine thing to clean a house and get a meal ready and all that sort of stuff. That's great. She wasn't doing anything bad, but she was over busy trying to do too much, trying to meet expectations, and as a result, she's miserable. And I think in so many ways, if we take a really close look at our lives, so many of us can get there. We're trying to meet other people's expectations. It's like, well, like other people, like their kids are maybe on this travel ball team, and I know my kid is only 4 years old and can't walk and chew gum at the same time, but if they're not on this, they'll never play Major League Baseball. And so, my gosh, I've got to get them on this travel team because other parents are going to expect that, like if I really value my kid. And I expect that for my kids, so I've got to do this. And I know we can't really afford it because travel ball is a racket. It's just my opinion. Some of y'all need to hear that. And it costs me $3,000 every weekend, but I just have to make this thing happen because other people got expectations. And I got to be a good parent. Like I've got these expectations of myself to give my kid every single possible opportunity because after all, I don't want them to miss out. And by the way, doesn't God want my kid to be the best I can be? So all these expectations, some of them are accurate, some of them are very inaccurate, some of them are maybe realistic, others not so much, but I've got all these expectations, and so I've got to do all this different stuff. And what happens? I end up miserable. We end up absolutely miserable. And again, not doing bad things, but trying to do way too many good things. And the problem with doing way too many good things is it actually keeps us from a great life, because the enemy of great is not bad. The enemy of great is actually good. And many times what makes us miserable is not doing a whole bunch of bad things. It's trying to do way too many good things. So, we've talked about what to do if you want to stop being miserable all series. And so here's kind of the last week, the final idea here that we'll run with. If you want to stop being miserable, stop trying to do it all. If you want to stop being miserable, if you want to stop being frustrated, stressed, aggravated all the time, then you've got to stop trying to do everything. And again, that's difficult. Why? Because it's not bad things that we're dealing with. It's good things. But some of those good things, in fact, perhaps many of those good things, we're going to have to let go of. We're going to have to stop doing. We're going to have to start saying no to if we're going to stop being miserable. Now, again, why is this so hard? Well, good things and expectations. But are those expectations what should really be driving our life? Or should there be something different that determines our calendar? Should there be something different that determines our activities? Should there be something much, much different that determines what we say yes to and what we say no to? And perhaps the question to really think about here, and we'll tease this out a little later, is simply this. It won't be on the screen, but you can write it down if you're taking notes, or if you're at home taking notes, you can write it down. Who am I really trying to keep happy? Better yet, as the focus of my life, who do I want to be happy the most? Who am I trying to impress? Because in many cases, the reason we have a hard time saying no, the reason we overload ourselves is because we're trying to impress someone. And sometimes it's other people, sometimes it's ourselves, sometimes it's God. But that line of thinking is going to make you miserable. And that's what Jesus points out to Martha here in verse 41. Check this out. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things. What makes you worried and upset? Many things. You're trying to do too much. You've got way, way too much going on. See, here's what happens in our lives. We treat our lives much like we treat Thanksgiving dinner. There's so much good stuff. And we're like, well, I've got to get some of this, and some of this, and some of this, and some of this. And it all looks like awesome stuff. And then 15 minutes later, you're sitting there with this nasty, greasy feeling in your stomach. And you're like, man, I got way too much food. I had that happen to me not once, but twice around Thanksgiving. Why? Too much. Trying to eat too much. Trying to do too much. And that's what happens with our lives. Again, it's not bad things. It's good things. But we overload our plate, and as a result, we get worried and upset, just like Martha, trying to do too much. And where Jesus is going to lead here is to this idea that something has to go. In fact, probably a lot of things have to go if we're going to stop being miserable. So it begs the question, well, what is that? And we're going to ask a series of questions here. Some will be on the screen, some won't, but we'll kind of tease that out or point that out as far as which is which. We're going to ask some questions here that I think will help us identify, okay, what do I need to get rid of? Better yet, what would Jesus be leading me to get rid of? And the first question would be this: what would I quit today if I could? Like if I took, man, by the way, like if you're like, well, marriage is a drag, like that doesn't count. If you're like, man, if I could just give my kid up for adoption, can't do that. Okay, so there are certain things. If you're like, well, I just really don't enjoy going to church, like that's not an option. So there are some things that's like, okay, like you can't stop doing those things. But back up and look at the course of your life and understand there are some things that can't go, right? Like Jesus, your spouse, your kids, like those are permanent fixtures in your life. But if you look at like the rest of your life, the rest of the spectrum of your life, if you're looking at it honestly, what would you quit today if you could? What would you give up right now? If somebody came along and said, hey, I'll take anything off your plate. It doesn't matter what it is. You can just give it to me. What would be that thing, that activity, that task, that habit, that hobby that you would give up? Now, another little point about this to be made. Sometimes what we often default to is the thing that we think is easiest to give up instead of the thing that actually needs to be given up. Because sometimes we know what we should give up, but like there's people's expectations involved, maybe ours, maybe we think God's expectations are involved. So we try to find like the easiest thing in the world to give up. So we're like, well, I'll give up like my social media habit. And maybe that should be something that you do. But maybe there's other things in your life that actually consume way more time that you should give up. You know, sometimes it's like, well, I'll give up like meeting with this person for lunch once a week. And it's like, yeah, but if that's already in the rhythms of your week, then is that really the thing that needs to go? Or is it all these other things that kind of happen off work hours or outside the home or something like that you maybe need to give up? You know, for instance, one thing I see happen, and this is not like to knock anybody, this is just something I see as a pastor. So often what I'll see happen is somebody will say, hey, I'm tired and burned out, like I need to step down from serving. And listen, there are some times where that needs to happen. Like I just took a sabbatical, so I get it. There are some times where you need to take a break. But what I see happen so often in that situation is, yeah, like People aren't getting burned out by serving on Sunday. What's burning them out is the 5,000 different things they're doing during the week. It just seems like the Sunday thing is the easiest thing to go, as opposed to backing up and making some really hard decisions that would disappoint other people during the week. So that can tend to happen. We can tend to look at the easiest thing as opposed to the thing that actually needs to go. So what would you quit today if you could? What should you quit today? What's distracting you? Here's a good thing to think about. What's distracting you from Jesus? What's distracting you from your spouse? What's distracting you from your kids? What's distracting you from showing Jesus to other people? What's constantly pulling you off mission as a follower of Jesus? Those are things that they absolutely need to be on the chopping block. Because if we never say no to anything, if it's always yes to everything, guess what? We're going to be like Martha, worried and distracted about many things, and we're going to end up miserable. And we'll never end up in the great place in life that many of us want to reach, because the enemy of great, again, it's not bad, it's good. And here's the thing about great. It doesn't require a whole lot of things to be done. In fact, Jesus is going to point out that it actually only requires one thing. Watch this, verse 42. Jesus said this, "But few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her." What's Jesus' point here? He's like, listen, Martha, you're doing all this stuff trying to meet others' expectations. You're trying to meet your expectations. You're trying to meet what you think are my expectations. Well, guess what? I don't have those expectations on you. I never said I wanted an awesome meal or a clean home. You know what all Jesus wants from each of us? He just wants us to spend time with Him. In fact, Jesus is pointing out the one thing that's actually needed is what Mary chose. Not doing all this housework, not doing all this other stuff, not the many things that Martha did, but just simply being with Jesus. You might say, why is that important, to my schedule? Well, that's a bit of a nuanced conversation. Let's start here. As a follower of Jesus, our destiny is to become more like Jesus. In fact, you probably know that. You're like, okay, yeah, I know I'm supposed to be like Jesus. So how do you become more like Jesus? Well, you always become like who or what you hang around. For instance, when I was a kid on PBS, there used to be this show called Shining Time Station. I think they repackaged it as Thomas and Friends or something like that. But the conductor back in the day was a guy named Ringo Starr. He was a drummer for the Beatles, and so he talked with a British accent. So as a kid, 5, 6 years old, I started developing a little bit of a British accent. And apparently it stuck with me a little bit, even into my days in student ministry class. I had a student ask me one time, they're like, "Are you from Scotland?" I'm like, "I don't think so." But so this little thing stuck with me all the way into maybe adulthood a little bit. Why? Because I hung around with this guy as a teenager through a TV experience, right? We become who or what we hang around. And so let me ask you this. If you never hang around Jesus, how are you going to become more like Jesus? If you never connect with Jesus, how in the world are you going to become more like Jesus? So the question we need to be asking ourselves is this. Jot this down. How can I be with Jesus every day? How can I be with Jesus every single day? And you might say, okay, well, again, what does that have to do with my schedule? This right here. The more you hang out with Jesus, the more you become like Jesus. But guess what? Something else happens too. The more you hang out with Jesus, the more you're able to discern His voice, the more you're able to tell whether He's telling you to do something or to not do something. But you'll never be able to discern that unless you hang out with Him enough to where you can readily recognize His voice. Because with so many good things in this world, sometimes it can be difficult to tell the difference between a good thing and a God thing, and the only thing that will direct you rightly is being able to hear and discern the voice of God directing you to what He wants you to go to. But if we never spend time with Him, it's going to be very difficult. In fact, I would argue almost impossible to hear His voice and know what He wants us to do. So how can we be like Mary? How can we be with Jesus every day? 3 options that I'll throw out for you real quick. First, starting on December 1st, in our Facebook group, this is not our Facebook page, it's a different thing, but in our Facebook group, we're going to post a verse of the day every single day. And so if you're like, man, reading in the Bible is a challenge for me, guess what? There's going to be a verse posted in our Facebook group every single day, like at 6 o'clock in the morning. You can pull that up, look at it, kind of marinate it on it, pray through it. That'll give you kind of a quick hit. Right there. And if you'll let that verse kind of sink into your heart all day, that'll change your life. In fact, one verse that you meditate on an entire day will do way more in your heart than if you just read 2 chapters and never think about it the rest of the day. So if you're not in our Facebook group, you need to join our Facebook group, and that'll get you connected with that. The second thing is, most of us, if not all of us, have a smartphone. Guess what? You can download the YouVersion Bible app. It's free. That puts the Bible on your phone. You can carry the Bible with you everywhere. You can even create a profile. You can add friends. You can add me, Mark, whoever. You can start a little group of people that you read the Bible with. You do devotional plans with. It's a lot easier to pursue Jesus if you do it together as opposed to just trying to do it on your own. That would be another option. The third option would be something I'm incredibly excited about, and it'll be sent to you guys here through email in a week or a week and a half, somewhere in there. But we've signed up as a church for Right Now Media. Guess what it costs you? Absolutely nothing. But it puts like thousands of resources that will help you grow spiritually at your fingertips. And by the way, there's resources for your kids that will be at your fingertips for completely free. And if you have come to this church and you've given us your information, guess what? You get access to that for free. So there's options out there that literally cost you nothing except perhaps one thing, and that would be time. Because nobody can create more time. Like, all of us get the same amount of time. The question is, how are we going to schedule that time? How are we going to allocate that time? Who gets our time? And see, here's where Jesus so often gets crowded out. So often we do all this other good stuff, and we try to squeeze Jesus in if we can. Well, guys, here's what I've found in my own life. When I try to squeeze Jesus in, guess what? He always gets squeezed out. Because if we're not intentionally making space to connect with Jesus, it doesn't actually happen. We have to make space to be with Jesus. And I know the pushback is, man, I've got so much to do. I'm not sure I have the time. And if that's the case, there's 3 questions that I would encourage you to kind of navigate. They won't be on the screen, but you can write them down. The first one is this. Is Jesus Lord or not in your life? Is Jesus Lord or not? Is Jesus the one calling the shots? Because the first and primary thing that Jesus wants you and me to do every single day is to connect with Him. It's to spend time with Him. Jesus will always lead you to do that. So the question when it comes to whether or not we have time to connect with God through His Word is primarily this. Is He actually Lord? Is He actually in charge? Is He actually calling the shots? Or am I in charge? Which one is it? We have to answer that question. And if you'd say, well, yeah, He is Lord, He is in charge, then the second question I would ask is this: is He worth it? Is He? Do we have a high enough view of God, or are we in awe enough of Jesus to say, man, Jesus is worth more than anything in this world. He's worth more than anyone else in the world. And even if I don't get to all these other things in the world, like the single most important thing, because Jesus is so worthy, He's so awesome, He's so glorious, He's so magnificent. If nothing else gets done, I don't care if I'm late for work. I don't care if I don't get to spend time doing anything I want to do today. If nothing else happens, I've got to connect with Jesus because He's worth more than anyone or anything else in the entire universe. Is that how we view Jesus? Is He actually worth it? Or is Jesus just kind of a divine vending machine that we go put a quarter in when we need something? Is Jesus kind of just a ticket out of hell that, okay, maybe I prayed a prayer 10 years ago, but He doesn't really impact my day-to-day life? Is Jesus actually worth it, guys? Does he carry the weight in our lives? Do we have a high enough view of God? Do we see God as awesome, as glorious, as magnificent? And so much so that everything else, every relationship, everything we could ever have in this world is like what Paul says, rubbish by comparison. Is Jesus worth it enough to you to make time for him? Because that's another kind of, that's a gut check for many of us. And I think the reality would be for a lot of us, if we're being honest, we just don't have a high enough view of God. And so we treat him like he can be squeezed in as opposed to seeing him as the awesome Lord and Savior that he is and saying, hey, God, if nothing else happens, you get the first spot, period. And then the third question would be this. Well, Dylan, if I do this, is it going to be worth it? And to that I would say, absolutely. Because here's what will happen. If you put Jesus in the first spot, you spend time with him, guess what? You'll be more like him. You'll discern his voice. Guess what? He'll start telling you things that you need to stop doing. Now that's going to be uncomfortable. And you're going to have to disappoint some people. You're going to have to disappoint yourself. And you won't say, but what about expectations God puts on me? Jesus doesn't put any expectations on you other than you simply follow him. And here's what's true about following Jesus. Following Jesus is never going to lead you to burnout. Where he leads you to is green pastures. In fact, watch this. Matthew 11:28 through 30. It says this. Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Following Jesus doesn't make you miserable. In fact, if you feel like God is asking you to do 500 things, chances are God ain't asking you to do all those things because Jesus is never going to drive you to burn yourself out. The only thing Jesus asks of us is, hey, come to me, connect with me, spend time with me, and guess what? You'll find rest. And then he says this, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Come to Jesus, and then guess what? Take his yoke on him. What does that mean? It means listen to him and do what he says. Again, what he says. Not what other people say I should do, not what I say I should do, not what a religious system says I should do, but what does Jesus tell me to do? Take his yoke on yourself, and guess what? You find rest for your souls. Why? Because, verse 30, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. If you find yourself running around trying to get it all done, trying to do way too much, guess what? I can promise you, Jesus didn't put that burden on you. We assume that burden. And maybe it was to make somebody happy. Maybe it was to make ourselves happy. Maybe it was because we were taught a wrong picture of God that says he requires us to do all this stuff to keep him happy, where the only thing Jesus calls us to do is just come to him. Come to him, learn from him, and as we do that, as we listen to him, guess what? He relieves us. He gives us rest. He frees us from the burdens we're carrying around. And guess what? We stop being miserable. And we start being joyful. So let's pray. Father, Lord, I pray today that as we head out of this series and head into the Christmas season, that you will help us be able to identify the things that you actually call us to do and that you want us to do, and that you would give us the courage to drop the things that are simply too much. And that we wouldn't try to measure up with the expectations of others or our own expectations, and you would correct us when we have wrong expectations of you that have put burdens on us that you never called us to bear, and we would simply prioritize in our lives being with you and making time for you and pursuing you, knowing that as we do that, you'll lead us perfectly. With heads bowed and eyes closed this morning, how many of you would say today, man, you know what? I'm trying to do way too much, and there's some things that need to go, and I need to prioritize connecting with Jesus. If that's you, would you just lift your hand up real quick? If that's you this morning. Fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. Father, I pray for those who have recognized they're trying to do too much and they need to prioritize being with you, Jesus, whether they're here in the room or watching online, Lord, I pray you give them the courage to cut out the things that need to be cut out so they can choose that which is better, and that's you, Lord. As you continue praying this morning, for some of us, Jesus is simply not Lord. We've never come to the point in our lives where we said, okay, Jesus, you're in charge now. You call the shots. And I'm yours. See, that's what it means to actually follow Jesus. It's not simply I pray a prayer to get out of hell. It's no, I throw my lot behind him. I take his yoke on me. I connect with him and I say, Jesus, you direct me now. Has that ever happened in your life? If not, whether you're here in the room, whether you're watching online, just simply where you sit, just call out to him and say, Jesus, I'm sorry for trying to be in charge. I'm sorry for running from you. I'm sorry for rebelling against you. But today, Lord Jesus, you take control. In fact, you're the only one worthy of living life for. Because you died on the cross for my sin, and you rose from the grave, and you are Lord. You are Lord alone. And so I'll follow you wherever you tell me to go. And I'll listen to your direction. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much for joining us today with LifeSpring Church Online. I'm Mark. I'm one of the pastors here at LifeSpring, and I'm super thrilled that you joined us today. If you found today's message helpful, by the way, take a minute, share it with a friend, invite someone to join you next week to come back as we continue to offer hope week after week with LifeSpring Church Online. Specifically, if you're new, I want to give you a big shout out and say thank you so much for joining us. We believe that God has truly made you unique, and God has made you to be a difference maker. And one of our goals at LifeSpring Church is to help you step into that reality. What does it look like for you to become the difference maker that God has wired you to be? So if there's any way that we can help you, we would love to do so. By the way, if you're not following us on Facebook, before you get off your phone or tablet today or your laptop, take a minute, follow us on Facebook. We would love to connect with you that way and let you stay in touch with what's going on through LifeSpring Church and how God's working in our community. At LifeSpring, we say this all the time, but we truly believe it, that God has called us to make a difference in our community. And we believe that the way that will happen is as we live for God, as we love all people, and as we lead others to do the same. And we gather together every week so that we can be sent back out. So at this time, LifeSpring Church, you are sent.